Folks, thank you for joining us today for our DC LERA webinar. We're thrilled to have a very well-known speaker from IG Metall in Germany, who will be talking about the response of German employers and workers and the government to the COVID-19 catastrophe that the whole world is dealing with. I'm Steve Slay. I'm the president of DC LERA this year and a longtime member of the National LERA. I was the LERA National President, 2005, 2006. We have our LERA national folks hosting the meeting, Emily Smith and Bernadette Thiemann. They're online with us to help make sure everything goes smoothly. We really appreciate all of our DC LERA folks and guests for joining us today. And I'll have some more announcements towards the end of the session about upcoming webinars. But with that little bit of a background, I'm going to turn it over to Anja Wehler-Schoeck in just a second. We will have questions and answers, a good 15 minutes towards the end for a dialogue with Horst and Professor Steve Silvia, who will also be presenting today. So hold your questions, though if you do have a sort of a burning question in the middle of the presentation, just use the raised hand function and we'll try to call on you. One of the great strengths of the DC LERA chapter is our international cohort of participants. And we've got folks from the Spanish embassy, from the Korean embassy, from the Taiwan embassy, and the Swedish embassy and others. And we are really thrilled to have Anja, who is a real expert on labor relations, who is our committed person from the German embassy. And with that, Anja, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Welcome from my side as well. I think we have a very interesting and timely topic for our discussion today, addressing the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on workers in the German and US metalworking sectors. As Steve mentioned, I'm Anja Wehler-Schoeck, for those of you who don't know me. And Steve asked me to say a few words about the position of labor counselor at the German embassy. I'm based here in Washington, DC, but we have about 25 labor counselors around the world at strategic embassies. And they have been either appointed by the German Trade Union Confederation, as in my case, or by the German Ministry of Labor. And we focus on labor market issues and labor relations, but also often have other responsibilities like health policy, immigration, or social affairs. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome my former colleague, my former FES colleague, Horst Mund, as a speaker for today's event. Horst previously served as FES's coordinator for international trade union, for our international trade union program. But since 2006, he works at IG Metall in Frankfurt now and serves as their director of the Transnational Department. And in this capacity, he has been very involved in transatlantic labor relations. And he was, for example, instrumental in setting up the Transatlantic Labor Institute in Spring Hill, Tennessee, which was a joint project between the IG Metall and the UAW to support organizing in the South, especially in the auto sector. Unfortunately, the TLI had to close last summer, but maybe Horst, you can share a few words also about your experience with this project. Mm-hmm. And Horst's presentation will be followed by an input from our very own Steve Silvia to provide an overview of the impact of the pandemic on workers in the US, especially in the auto sector. And for those of you who don't know Steve, he's a professor of international relations and an affiliate professor of economics at the American University here in Washington, DC. And Steve has spent considerable time in Germany working, for example, with the Hans Böckler Foundation. And he's really a phenomenal resource when it comes to comparative labor relations between Germany and the EU and the US. And our DC LERA president, Steve Slay, will add a few insights about the impact of the pandemic on aerospace workers in the US. Because before Steve started his consulting firm, he worked for the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers for many years. And we'll then open the floor to your questions. And as Steve said, you can either raise your electronic hand or you can just type a question in the chat and then I'll call on you during the discussion. And for those of you who don't know where the electronic hand is, it's under reactions. So without further ado, Horst, you have the floor. We're looking forward to an exciting exchange.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anja, and thanks, Steve, for inviting me and for sharing some of the experiences we are making now with addressing the COVID-19 pandemic from a workers' perspective, representing the Metal Workers Union here in Germany. For those of you who don't know IG Metall, we have approximately 2.2 million members. That makes us the biggest union in Germany, and the bulk of our members have a car background or background in the automotive sector, either OEMs or in the supplier industries. If I started now to talk about the experiences we have made down south, I would use up more of the time that is allotted to me. I will just quote a good friend of mine who entitled an article he wrote about the way labor unions dealt with German car companies in the south. So you think you can dance. And that was Stephen Silvia, actually. Yeah. Meaning that, well, we all went there, our friends from the UAW and us, with the hope that we could really make a difference in organizing Germany-based companies, not only the OEMs like Volkswagen in Tennessee, Daimler, or Mercedes in Alabama, and BMW in South Carolina, but even more so the suppliers. So that is not the topic for today, but I would really be interested to share this in one of these days in another occasion. COVID-19, the time that is allotted to me, I would use briefly to talk about, well, how we are affected in Germany in general by this pandemic, what the situation or the impact of the economy is, but more importantly, what instruments we used, we as labor unions also demanded in addressing this pandemic. And at the end, I will maybe briefly touch upon the recent collective bargaining round that we have started that actually will really get on and will hopefully gain momentum next Monday, 1st of March. So let me try to share the presentation that I have started. So in terms of, can you, hope you can see if Anja or Steve, wonderful. So, well, where are we? We have approximately 2.3 million cases of COVID in Germany, and until October and November, very few deaths, comparatively speaking, compared to other countries. The casualty rate has increased since then, and still we compare relatively favorably. So the first wave, as we called it, hit us more or less a year ago, and we went into lockdown in March. Then the figures recovered in the sense that things got a little better, so restrictions were gradually lifted in summer. And experts already warned us of a second wave, which then came into being in October, November. So since then, we are again in a more or less, not in a complete lockdown, but there are severe restrictions on the social contacts. Industry is working, but a lot of other institutions, offices, museums, galleries are closed. Retail is closed. Restaurants are closed. You can't have your haircut, as you can well see since early December. Schools, kindergartens, universities are closed. Also, some, at least schools and creches or kindergartens have now been reopened. So we see that the numbers have gradually gone down again, and now we already talk about a third wave that we face as those mutations now become more and more prevalent. The South Africa, the British mutant. So that is something that we will face. In terms of casualties, I've spoken. So everyone was very optimistic with regard to vaccinations, and we all know never in the history of mankind has a vaccine been developed so swiftly. What we see in Germany that the number of people that have had their shot is comparatively low. So we have a rate of less than 2%, 1.5 million Germans that have been vaccinated or that have had their 2 shots, and that is definitely much less than what you have in the US and also what is happening in the UK, for example, and we don't talk about countries like Israel and so forth. There is a pledge by our government that by the end of the summer, everyone in Germany will have had the opportunity to get a vaccination if he or she chooses to do so. So that's the background where we are now. In terms of economic situation, we see that there used to be, or there was a relatively quick recovery after a sharp decline in spring. So the third quarter saw this good recovery, so that all in all, we've had a GDP decline of approximately 5% in 2020, and we now expect a 3% growth rate in 21, and experts say that the pre-COVID level will be reached by the end of 21-22, but that depends now on the future development of the COVID mutations in particular. Now, what did we, just to take a look at the unemployment rate. So we would have expected without COVID a figure of 2.4 million people jobless, and the COVID effect, as we called it, can be put at roughly 500,000 jobless, which is still a relatively modest increase in absolute figures and also in terms of the unemployment rate. And that is mainly due to the instruments in the toolbox of the labor market policymakers, and a key instrument in that toolbox is the short-time employment or short-time work allowances. This is basically, or it's based on a very old law. I myself was surprised to learn that it goes back to 1910. This law, when the so-called potash law was introduced. But in more recent times, it has been traditionally an instrument for mainly for construction workers who were not able to work in winter time. So people who are entitled for unemployed or for short-time benefits until recently got 60% of the lost wages, and that money came from the employment agencies, or 67% if you were living in a family with kids. So 60% for a single household. We demanded, and we as labor unions in general in Germany demanded an increase of this 60 or 67% respectively to 80 or 87%, because, well, the 1/3 loss of your income we thought was not acceptable. And I can already say at this stage that it was a success for us, for the German labor movement, that we were able to convince the government to increase the allowance to the 80 or 87% respectively. Now, this is an instrument that helps and enables companies to keep their workforce, for large part skilled labor, on the payroll, and at the same time reduce the cost of labor in times of recession. Of course, there are strings attached to it. There are conditions. You need to, or it's only applicable in a case of, well, cyclical crisis. We don't have a cyclical crisis now with the pandemic, or the temporary decline of work or orders because of events beyond the scope of the company, and that actually we do have. It is only available for companies who are otherwise healthy, but for this force majeure events, it is only possible to apply for a company, and it's a company who must do that, if at least 1/3 of their workforce would not have work. Originally, the maximum duration was limited to 12 months. It is now extended under the COVID scenario until end of 21. So we have been under this situation now, or we will have been for 2 years almost by the end of 21. Now, how does it function? Let's look at a very simple example here. You have the net monthly wages, and we assume that the working time needs to be reduced because there is actually no work by 50%. That would mean, under normal circumstances, a wage loss of 50%. You don't work half of the time, you don't get the money for half of the time. Now here comes the short-time allowance in, and it compensates for, at least partially, for the money or for the income that you lose. Now, lost wages, and there still are, in the first phase of the pandemic, so let's say March until May, June, we were able to negotiate with quite a number of companies supplements, so increases to 70 to 80%. And well, once we were successful, so to speak, politically, and the government increased the allowance to this 80 or 87%, the employers saved the money because they had negotiated with the union to pay out of their own pocket the supplement, whereas now, after this political, after the statutory allowance was increased, it was now the government who pays. But anyway, it's a win-win situation, we would say. Workers or working people, they keep their jobs and benefits, their entitlements to bonuses, vacations, company pensions, and so forth. You avoid also the psychological hardships that are attached to unemployment, and for employers, the benefits are clear. You can keep the qualified workforce, and we talk about the scarcity of skilled labor in Germany now because of demographics and so forth. So there's a competition for skilled labor, and dismissals in Germany are usually costly. You don't just fire or sack people, you have what we call social plans. So employers will have to pay, and also the cost of recruiting after the crisis. And that was very important 10 years ago, after the financial crisis was more or less over. German companies were very swiftly able to resume the production. It was really something where our industry, in particular, the export-oriented industry, not the least the car industry, profited to a great degree. And thirdly, it's also the companies that benefit, no, the government, sorry, that benefits from that, because there is no sharp increase in unemployment from that. So looking at the time, I will speed up. There are other elements of government measures. I just want to mention special regulations for parents, that there is a parental allowance in terms of additional paid leave, where 90% of net wages are paid for those parents, or for parents whose children are 12 years old or younger. And other elements also, which I skipped at this point. Let me very briefly talk about the collective bargaining round that we are facing. We do sector-wide bargaining in Germany. So it's the metal and electrical industry, as we call it, which includes also the car industry and so forth. So we are now in the process of negotiating for roughly 2.6 million people. So that is not, of course, we only negotiate for our members, but at the end of the day, most of people working in those sectors will benefit from what we agree. So the demand is that we demand a page increase of 4% for everybody. That takes into account, let's say, the medium-term situation of many companies. That is the other side, like it a lot. I can already tell you, they say no, nothing is possible. We also demand that parts of the increase in salaries can also be converted into extra time off. We further demand that there is job security, and in particular that for apprentices, a situation is there that improves security for them. We have a system, and I come then to the end, where beyond the duration of each collective agreement, we have a legal requirement not to start industrial action. No strikes, nothing. We call it industrial peace. And that peace period is now going on since end of December, and it expires on Sunday night or Monday morning, whatever you wish, 1st of March. And that is when the industrial action starts. No strikes. That is at the end of a long process, but we will make our voices heard, and that is possible also in Corona times. It's an extremely difficult collective bargaining route. This time we have employers that are even more intransigent as they were. Many of the companies will really want to make use of this crisis for what they call right sizing. They want, let's say, not to waste an opportunity again, as they say, which they had 10 years ago, when through all sorts of social dialogue and common negotiations, they said, okay, they could have, let's say, gained more of it. So that is, well, longer than I was allowed to speak and shorter than I would have wanted to. So thank you very much for that.
Well, thank you very much, Horst. That was very insightful, and I think we'll come back to many of the topics that you mentioned in the discussion. I'd like to give the floor to Steve right away, to Steve Silvia, and to provide a brief contrast on how things played out in the US. The floor is yours, Steve.
Sure. Thank you very much, Anja, and thank you, Horst, for your presentation. One of the key thing that I've been told, and I think rightfully, is to be brief. So I'm not going to go into depth about COVID or the macroeconomy in the United States, but I am going to say, I'm going to focus on the automobile sector. And I will say one thing, though, in advance, and that is important context, and I think it also contrasts the United States from Germany, is that what a political scientist would call the regulatory state of the United States really abandoned American workers with the COVID crisis. That one looks into particularly what the Occupational Safety and Health Administration did and did not do during the crisis, or has not done during the crisis. It's been quite problematic during the Trump administration. That is slated to change. I'll talk about that at the very end. But it's clear, one thing which really stands out when you look at the research is back in 2017, OSHA was working on doing a set of standards for airborne pathogen diseases. And this was based on the SARS epidemic that happened, earlier in this century. And in 2000, and so OSHA had been working on this for 6 years. And in 2017, the Trump administration canceled it. And if it had been put into force, it would have set a whole series of standards, particularly for medical institutions, including nursing homes, that would have had a ready set of standards for dealing with airborne pathogens. And it's really remarkable the cost that probably brought about to our country. Once the COVID crisis came to the United States, OSHA, like many agencies of the US government, was understaffed and ill-prepared. And when workers started to bring cases to OSHA, that OSHA took up fewer than 3 of the more than 10,000 cases that were brought to it over the course of 2020. And as far as enforcement, fewer than half received any sort of citation, and those that received fines, the average workplace fine was around $15,000. So the U.S. Regulatory state really dropped the ball on this, and there were a few efforts to try to use the National Labor Relations Board to try to address the problems with OSHA, but they didn't go anywhere either. The general counsel at the time, Peter Robb, insisted that any case having to do with COVID would go to the general office, and very few cases went forward. So turning to the automobile sector, it was remarkable reviewing the material from earlier in the year. The thing that was striking is the fear and uncertainty that was in the air at the time. I certainly remember it well, and it reminded me of that. It was around mid-March that things came to a head. You know, there were a few people who were trying to downplay it, like Elon Musk, who in early March said the coronavirus panic is dumb. But it was clear, both within the big three US auto companies and the UAW, that this was a serious problem. How to deal with it, there was some tension, but by mid-month, with a little bit of exhortation of effort by the newly named head of the UAW, Rory Gamble, that the auto companies agreed to a shutdown, which they envisioned a 2-week shutdown that would end at the end of March, but it ended up actually being a 2-month shutdown. The parts supplier companies, things were a little more difficult, that tensions often would flare to a head between very nervous employees on the one hand and companies that wanted to meet their contracts to the big companies on the other hand. There was one instance at American Axle where the UAW rep there actually had to separate management from the employees to prevent a fistfight. So it was fear and uncertainty in that period that we all can recall if you think back. And when one looks at the impact of this total shutdown, that in February of last year, the auto industry produced 1.4 million units. In April, the auto industry produced 24,000 units. Now, during April, there was a lot of the retooling that happened. There was a recognition of the need to try to get back into work, and there was also the brave volunteers from the automobile sectors who volunteered to build ventilators and make personal protective equipment. And just with a contrast, when one looks at comparing the auto bailout of 2009 to the actual big bailout that happened, the CARES Act, which passed in late March, the auto companies were very sensitive about not wanting another bailout. So they did not ask for anything particular for the automobile sector. Some of the provisions helped the big companies a little bit, but most of the provisions in the CARES Act were aimed at small to medium-sized enterprises. So the beneficiaries in the auto sector from the CARES Act were more the parts suppliers, and they did benefit substantially from the CARES Act in terms of getting the loans, and that if they kept their employees, the loans could be forgiven, and that helped keep the parts people afloat. And so it was during April where there were in May where there was the retooling of and refitting of many factory floors. If you look at the picture here on the right, you can see curtains and other things that have been put up. I had another picture of a break room where it had plexiglass in the table like an X, and people sat in the different corners. They were each separated from each other by plexiglass. And by the time you get to end of May, most factories have been refitted to become usable in the context of the virus. Now, a thing that's striking when one looks at that, I have the COVID cases for Michigan, because the US, it wasn't uniform. There were different waves in different places. But the thing that's striking about the COVID cases up here is when we look at this spring period, this period that caused such fear and uncertainty, it's a relatively small wave compared to the big wave, the second wave that hit the United States beginning in October and only subsiding in January. And it is also striking that the automobile companies managed to keep producing during this wave and managed to have monthly output topping 1 million units in the months from June onward, despite all of the adjustments they had to make in the face of COVID. And the losses, the industry lost about 2.5 million units in 2020, but that came in the April to May period. It didn't come in the period after that. There were supplemental agreements. They're in the PowerPoints. I'm just going to go over them quickly because I don't want to take too much time. That just there was an arrangement to make sure that if you were out of work because of COVID, in essence, your salary would be covered. If you had to quarantine, your salary would be covered. Those were the arrangements that the big three auto companies made. The arrangements weren't so generous for many of the parts producers. So this is my concluding slide. And I just want to mention that the difference between the executive branch and its handling of the COVID crisis has been, black and white between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Joe Biden went out of his way to meet with union members virtually, or union leaders virtually after he was elected. And once he was in office on day 2, he signed an executive order on protecting worker safety and health. And the executive order called for OSHA to issue revised guidelines, which they did on February 1st. And it also called for OSHA to investigate and issue emergency temporary standards if deemed necessary by March 15th. So there's going to be a substantial change in a set of regulations that will be, which should be coming in a little over a couple weeks. And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve Silvia. And Steve Slay, do you want to follow up right away and add a few words from the aerospace workers?
Sure. I'll tackle both aerospace and aviation, which are obviously closely intertwined. The pandemic just slaughtered air travel globally. In the same period of time that Steve Silvia was talking about the decline in the auto industry back in the spring, the airline industry collapsed by nearly 90%, bringing to a virtual halt production of aircraft. But there was a substantial bailout for the airlines in the aviation sector, and including the workforce, which was essentially made whole. And that's been extended several times. The extension of benefits for airline workers will continue until the end of March, and then we'll see if there's an extension on that. But on the aerospace production side, specifically on commercial aviation, the Boeing, who's the largest employer in the commercial aircraft in the world, reduced their workforce by nearly 30% in their production in their commercial aircraft group. Boeing also curiously refused to take any money from the government because they felt like the terms of the assistance was too onerous. And what that boils down to is that they didn't want the government to have any say on executive compensation, share buybacks, or other tools of corporate governance. But what they don't say though is that the Federal Reserve did a backdoor bailout of Boeing by buying the bonds that Boeing floated in the marketplace, essentially a $20 billion loan from the marketplace underwritten by the Federal Reserve. So that money is rapidly running out. We'll see what happens if the airline sales rebound. It's anticipated that they won't rebound anytime soon. So the aviation sector and the aerospace production sector are both under tremendous stress. And as Steve Silvia pointed out, we have a very ad hoc kind of response to these kind of downturns in the United States, unlike Germany, where you have a systemic across the board approach. This was different in Seattle and Wichita. And so it's sort of a marker of our disaggregated system of labor relations and employment regulation in the US that many workers are left out in the cold, but some are receiving the enhanced unemployment. But as Horst pointed out, these are highly skilled workers, and it's not entirely clear that they will go back to work for their employers when the things pick back up. So a lot of dislocation, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of pain that came with the COVID pandemic, and it hit across the industries. That's about it, Anja.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I invite you all now to ask your questions, raise your electronic hand, or type your question in the chat. And while you're all thinking about questions, Horst, I have a quick question for you. Do you think that there are any permanent changes that have been caused by the challenges that you listed for the pandemic, and that some of the changes might be a positive trend or a trend to the contrary?
Yeah. Well, if I look at industry, or let's take again the example of the car industry, we see COVID and all the crisis aspects of it coming on top of a already extremely challenging situation. We use the term transformation for the profound structural changes the industries are going through. You can talk about, let's say, all the things that come with digitization of products, car industry, but also of processes, the way we produce. That has an extremely heavy impact. If you look at the challenges deriving from climate change, so how do we make industry and our society more sustainable? That has already been a challenge, and these aspects will stay there. So if I look at what comes through COVID, I see something that will stay. People will work much more mobile. They will work from home to a much larger degree, out of necessity now. I'm in the office, but there's hardly anyone, well, there are people here, but not the 500 people in the building. We may be 50 right now. Maybe we're 70, I don't know, but less than 20% of the people. So I think the ratio of home office has come up to 24%. Okay, you can't produce cars in the home office or build a plane in home office, so that definitely will not change. But the industries have already started to undergo profound changes, and that will continue. What is not yet clear, and that is an open question, is the degree of globalization and globally integrated supply chains. if there will be some kind of relocation back and closer to the OEMs. Again, out of necessity. Companies may opt for, let's say, we need more in-house production to keep people on the job, but also to make the companies less vulnerable through their big exposure on foreign suppliers. The big thing for the car industry is electronic chips. There's this large scarcity. Companies all over the world lose production because, well, our kids want to use their PlayStations, or we need them for smartphones. So there's this big scarcity, and to get less dependent on that. Another example in that respect is let's say battery production. Again, from German perspective, parts of the original R&D was done in Germany. Production was leaving Germany and has been made now, is happening to a large degree in Asia, Japan, Korea, of course, also Japan. But I think these long-term trends that will affect at least our industries more than this COVID pandemic, which is terrible, which has cost many lives and much too many, but I think will be addressed and we will overcome this. But the long-term structural changes are here to stay and need to be worked on by us, I think.
Thank you very much, Horst. And we have a couple of questions now, and I would ask Tequila to ask hers first, because you just touched upon the supply chain aspect, which I think is a very important one also in context of the US discussion about moving parts of the supply chain back home to the US. Tequila, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, sure. Thank you, Anja. This is a really wonderful panel. I've learned so much. My question relates to the big international auto companies in the US and Germany and aerospace companies. What kind of steps have the companies taken to ensure COVID safety in their global affiliates and supply chains? Thank you so much.
And do you want to go ahead, Horst, and answer?
Yeah, of course, it is part of, let's say, the global responsibility of the companies to address the situations in their global production footprint, be it, let's say, if you work for Ford, it's not a German company in South Africa or India, or for BMW in the US. Okay, there you have others who can take care of that. So I think that has happened, but let's face it, always in the context of the national setup, the national legal framework, the national health policies. And we find, and now I speak for my union, we always find it really difficult to persuade our companies to take seriously their responsibility, in the sense that they should not treat workers differently. Now, if you don't need COVID to see that there is a little bit of, well, differential treatment if you look at the way workers are free to organize and join unions in Germany or not to join. And the same companies who say, okay, it's freedom of association and join unions, they go to places like Chattanooga or Spartanburg and act completely differently. So there, I'm afraid our influence is limited, I would say.
Yeah, And I think if we have time later, Horst, I don't know if you can mention anything about the new supply chain legislation in Germany. That would be
that is a good point. Yeah, very good.
You want to go ahead and add something on this right now?
Yeah, why not? Thank you for the Stichwort, whatever that is in English. We have been lobbying for a long time for legally binding instruments in terms of, well, the due diligence when it comes to human rights, including labor rights. So not voluntary instruments, we all have them, but really hard law. And this culminated in a project for a law, a supply chain law that is now in the making. And that is the result of years and years of lobbying. And it's fair to admit, German labor unions were late starters in that. It was the NGOs who were there, who were really tough on that. But now the draft law, as it emerges, and it will still have to be seen, that requires companies with more than 3,000 employees, a figure we don't like, to make sure that human rights are warranted wherever they produce, also for suppliers, only for suppliers of the first level suppliers, not through the entire supply chain. That is something that we don't like about that law. As well, there are other elements that we criticize, but generally speaking, it's a big achievement, I would say, under the circumstances, and it's as good as any legislation that you would have, and it will definitely, I'm sure about that, make a very positive impact, also through one aspect in that workers now can, with the help of non-governmental organizations and labor unions, also sue the companies. So we would get the legal entitlement to help our comrades abroad in suing our companies. And that is something we will definitely look into very carefully.
Thank you, Horst. And I have three questions that revolve around the role of co-determination and the imbalance between represented workers and not represented workers, and worker protections as fought for by the unions. So I'll call on Benjamin, then Knut and Lucia to ask their questions. Benjamin, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, yeah, my question was just what role does co-determination play? Do you think co-determination helps give the unions more power in protecting workers from COVID and generating a more robust response from the government, compared to the US or other countries?
The answer is yes. No, that's the brief one. Now, I would definitely say yes, because the one aspect of co-determination, that is co-determination at the company level, enables works councils, which to a very large degree, in our case, have IG Metall members as members. It enables the workers in a shop, in a factory, to address issues directly. So it's always this third-party outsider argument that companies use and that they don't like. But co-determination is for the workers and by the workers. So it's about occupational health and safety issues. It's about working time. It's about all sorts of issues directly linked to the concrete needs and challenges and situations at the company. So the answer is a definite, in that case, yes. And this is not to say that this is the only way that things can be done. So I've learned in the past a little bit about what US labor unions do. And I was really surprised, and coming from very high, arrogant kind of German perspective. So I was really surprised to see that you have co-determination in the US. You just call it joint programs, like in the auto industry. Of course, there are differences, and the biggest, or one of the bigger differences, is that we have co-determination by law.
Right.
That you have in the US and in other countries, you have to struggle and fight for it in each and every company. So that makes things much easier also for us compared to the situation in the US. But you have a new administration, so maybe, and that is what I thought, there could be interested in parts and elements of the experiences made elsewhere.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. But I think in terms of labor legislation, there are still some fundamental differences, like
Absolutely.
with the elections, and there is no multi-union shop in the US, as far as I know. But I think with the new administration, there will be many openings to cooperate more intensively on this. And Knut, you are next.
Yeah, thank you. Good seeing a lot of old friends, and old, I mean in long-term friends.
Thank you, Knut.
I had a quick question on the change in the labor market, also from the German perspective. Do you expect permanent scarring, so to speak, for those workers who you represent and who are very well protected, especially compared to the US, and those who are less protected? And do you see the pandemic also putting things into a more structural way that are problematic for workers who are not represented by a union and who are, you know, increasingly working in the growing gig economy?
Yeah. First of all, we already see that the pandemic also takes a toll, so to speak, on our capacity to represent workers. It may be relatively or comparatively easier to organize workers in Germany compared to the US, but it's not self-evident. It's not that you just walk into the company and say, "Hey, here we are, IG Metall or whoever, so come and join us." Each and every union in Germany has to fight for each and every new member. So from IG Metall perspective, I can say that we have been modestly successful in the past 10 years, so to speak. We have been able to maintain and grow very modestly, but grow a little in a situation where we have to organize 100,000 members every year new, because we're losing approximately that number each and every year for demographic reasons and so forth. So all the net gain of the last 10 years is gone through the crisis. So people leave labor unions. That makes us well, not stronger, but in the long run, if that trend would continue or continued, it would make us weaker. And definitely, employers, not all, but employers and employers' federations try to profit from the crisis to set things right, to drive their agenda, if you call it liberal or neoliberal or capitalist, whatever. And it's legitimate, I would say, from their point of view. They just profit from a situation where the balance of power is shifting again in their favor. So it is not so much the organized labor that is affected so far. It is much more the already precariously employed. The agency workers, or you mentioned the gig workers, so they are really in deep trouble because only too often they work as self-employed. So they don't even are entitled to unemployment benefits or short-time work allowance. So that is really a serious problem, and they fall not through the safety net, but they fall to the lowest level, and that is definitely a big problem.
And I think, Anja, we're just about out of time here, but I think Lucia had a question.
Yes, Lucia, why don't you go ahead and briefly ask the last question, and then we can wrap it up.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm also running out of time because I have to be in another meeting. But so first of all, thank you for all the explanation and the key points. I think it's super interesting. Just a quick question, and I will focus on Mr. Mund. Do you have in IG Metall or German unions any initiative for promoting vaccination among the workers, or does any of the sort exist in Germany? And thank you so much again.
Yeah, yes and no. It's organized by government. Vaccination centers are set up. So that is relatively well organized. Only the vaccination itself is missing. We don't have the doses somehow. So we were so well organized in setting up centers and tents and blah blah blah. We were very early, and then somehow those who are in charge realized, okay, we should have ordered more doses. So that is the problem, and it's not done at the company level, except for some really big companies. So you take the example of the Wolfsburg plant of Volkswagen. More than 60,000 people work there. So there it makes sense. They also have the space. They can logistically create, let's say, these vaccination centers where social distancing is guaranteed and so forth. But that's an exception. So it's basically the government who set up the centers, and now in phase 2, we talk about, let's say, the general, what is a general physicist, the normal doctor you would go to, who will also be responsible for doing that.
Fantastic. Really appreciate you, Horst, and Anja, and Steve Silvia for a really fantastic presentation and conversation. We are actually doing a webinar in June on the gig economy workers and their legal status here in the US. We'll hope that you will join us for that, Horst, as a participant. And we have Elisa McBride, the Secretary Treasurer of ASME, will be joining us on March 17th to talk also about the public sector COVID and the impact of the Janus decision on public sector workers.
Okay.
With that, my friends, we're going to sign off. Fantastic presentation. Thank you again, Horst. We will look forward to seeing you in the U.S. sometime soon. We hope. And again, we'll sign off here. And thanks again. Join us March 17th for our next seminar with Elisa McBride.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I hear the Wizards are doing not that bad. So. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. Bye-bye. Bye, Stephen. Bye, Steve. Bye, Anja. Ciao, ciao. Knut.
Bye.
Tschüss. Mike and Carsten.